Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My apologies for being away for a little too long. As you might have guessed, I'm not as regular a contributor to YouTube as many others are, but I do my best to check in as often as I can. Currently, I am trying to finish edits on the second volume of my history of USOs. That's unidentified submerged objects. And there are always other projects that demand my attention. Plus, you can tell that not only do I not have a producer for this program, but I have precious few video skills to begin with. So if I'm able to get myself in front of the computer to put my thoughts out together for you, believe me, that's enough of a win for the day. Before I continue, let me encourage you to subscribe to my channel if you aren't already a subscriber. And if you decide later that you like this video after listening enough to it, by all means, please hit the like button and share this video. Now, when thinking about the current status of the UFO or UAP community, I'm struck by a few things. One, I'm struck by how fast information is coming out to us. That's no question. But B, how so little of it actually deals with the phenomenon itself. And don't get me wrong, much of what is coming out these days is fascinating, and it is worth talking about. A lot of it does deal with the phenomenon. I'm not saying that none of it does. Many of the recent whistleblowers have had some dramatic things to say about that, Matthew Brown being only the most recent of them. But so much of the conversation in the UAP community, my take on it centers either attacks on people's credibility or defense of their credibility. You get your dosage of unhelpful and probably useless predictions. 2027 probably being the most recent of these. Again, I'm just giving you my opinion here. You may disagree. You get a lot of discussion of disclosure efforts in Congress, or a lot of what just looks like plain old infighting within the community. Egos, arguments. Sometimes it feels like you're watching a dog chase his own tail. It's like we are compelled to chase every new headline out there, getting those clicks and likes. And I don't think it's all especially helpful. We do learn. There is information in there, but there's a lot of noise also. And unfortunately, a lot gets overlooked in an environment like that. And one is that we always seem to be chasing, when we go after that latest new thing, we can forget what in fact is a very powerful and solid foundation that was built for many, many years and decades before we even had an internet, much less social media. So let's talk about crash retrievals, for instance. We have heard a lot about the possibility of crash retrievals, the possession of alien technology and biologics, as David Grush noted. But you notice that all the attention, or let's say most of the attention, is focused on contemporary military insiders like David Grush or Lou Elizondo, who have made such claims. It's valid, it's perfectly valid, but there are some unfortunate side effects to it. Mainly, as I say, it tends to push aside 50 years worth of private research. It just pushes it all aside. And one problem is that by ignoring all this previous work, it's a lot easier for casual skeptics to just dismiss claims by contemporary military people as either unfounded or at worst as some kind of disinformation or an op. And it's a strange place to see all of this. You have people becoming skeptical about crash retrievals because they have a natural, and let's be honest, healthy skepticism regarding the military-industrial complex. We all do. And there's knowledge, too, that the U.S. government does engage in all kinds of false flags and psyops. We all know this. By now, that should be old news. So the tendency, this is kind of strange to me, again, of people whose skepticism of the government just a few decades ago would have made them more open to UFOs and to crash retrievals. Those same people now sometimes go the other way, and due to their distrust of the military and of the government, now they are often just as inclined to doubt UFOs and crash retrievals because it's coming from someone who is associated with the government. Or at least, the very least, they will doubt that UFOs or UAP are something genuinely anomalous and from outside our civilization. Now, let me just say, I think that's a lot easier to do if you do not know the history of research into this topic. If you have not studied the old books by people like Donald Kehoe or James and Coral Lorenzen or Edward Ruppelt and many, many others. Those were the true pioneers. They worked in the relative Stone Age, facing all kinds of opposition from the United States government and from the establishment in general. But they were like a dog with a bone. They knew they had something, and they tenaciously stayed with this subject, and we are far luckier for it as a result. So now the subject of UFO crash retrievals has its own history within the broader history of UFOs. You have a situation where for decades you have this dedicated group of researchers have been piecing together what I think arguably could be the most or one of the most explosive stories in human history. You know, the recovery of crashed extraterrestrial vehicles by world governments, particularly by the United States government. The story of UFO crash retrieval research really begins in the late 1970s when Leonard Stringfield, who was a very respected UFO researcher, decided to tackle a subject that, you know, all of his colleagues at the time really avoided it. Before Stringfield, this was crashed saucers were like a fringe topic within an already marginalized field. This had a lot to do with the public debunking of the subject way back from like early 1950s. It was actually a book that dealt with the Aztec crash of 1948. The author at that time was named Frank Scully, and his book was viciously and really unjustly debunked, but it was very effective. So as a result of that, for the next 25 years, UFO crash retrievals were just not done. By the way, the work of Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, who I consider friends, did a lot to rehabilitate that Aztec crash. And if you're not familiar with their work, I would recommend that to you anytime. But anyway, back then in the 50s and 60s and through most of the 70s, all of the crash retrieval stories were supposedly debunked. But then comes Stringfield. And there's Leonard Stringfield. In 1978, he presented a groundbreaking paper. It was called Retrievals of the Third Kind. This was at a MUFON symposium in Dayton, Ohio, right near U.S., one of the largest U.S. Air Force bases, and the source where so many rumors of crash retrieval material have gone to. So what Stringfield did back then in 78 this was really the first systematic attempt to document claims of UFO crash retrievals and, let's say, government custody of alien bodies. He described it, this is a guy, he had a way with words. He said, through patience, perseverance, and careful, courteous diplomacy, I have wended my way through the many shadowy mazes and found, to my surprise, sources of light at many of the so-called dead ends. That's Stringfield. His methodology was very straightforward, but it was actually quite challenging. Leonard Stringfield carefully interviewed military personnel, intelligence officers, and civilians who had claimed firsthand knowledge of crashed UFOs and recovered alien bodies. He protected their identities, often due to security concerns. He usually published anonymous testimonies, not every time. Sometimes names would go out there with their permission. But he was very good at protecting his witnesses. Now, that was a strength and a weakness because it protected his sources, but of course it opened him to criticism that his evidence was mainly anecdotal. Sound familiar? We deal with this to this day. So while Stringfield was collecting testimonies, there were two other researchers back in the late 70s, Stanton Friedman and William Moore. They were focusing on a specific incident that would become the cornerstone of crash retrieval research. You know what I'm referring to. That's the Roswell, New Mexico crash of July 1947. And Friedman really, Stan did a lot of work on this, and along with Bill Moore, and that culminated in a book from 1980, The Roswell Incident, which really brought the case into public consciousness for the first time. Roswell really was an idea whose time had come. And they did extensive on-the-ground investigation. They really surpassed even what Stringfield had started. They interviewed, I think, something like 100 witnesses, and Roswell really went from this obscure event into the world icon and symbol for the UFO cover-up. So there was always a lot of resistance to this right from the beginning. The U.S. government constantly denied any recovery of extraterrestrial craft. They still have. And researchers encountered what I think appeared to be organized resistance frequently. Stringfield, when he first presented his crash retrieval research back in 1978, he received threats. And he stated, he said, many questions to this day remain unanswered about the events of that day. I formally introduced UFO crash retrievals to research, mainly who was the culprit and who made the threats. He was threatened. He was at MUFON at the hotel in 78, and there was this whole cloak and dagger stuff to hide him away in his hotel room. There was serious concern for Leonard Stringfield's life. How serious it was, I don't really know. I wasn't there, but it was taken quite seriously at the time. But anyway, we all know about the government's handling of how Roswell was done. They talked about the weather balloon initially, then they went to the Mogul top secret balloon project, and then eventually they ended up saying, I think we dropped these crash test dummies from the air, and maybe people thought they were aliens. I mean, these are really absurd explanations, all of them each worse than the other. But one thing that you started seeing in the late 1970s, the UFO secrecy was really under a two-pronged attack. One was through stories like crash retrievals. People like Stringfield were digging out, and Stan Friedman and others. And then the other prong were researchers who were utilizing the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, to pry loose government documents. And there were a number of very, very dedicated researchers who made a lot of headway in that. But I'm going to focus for the remainder of this talk on Leonard Stringfield. I've talked about him before. To me, he was the greatest of the crash retrieval pioneers. The man tirelessly spoke with witnesses, sometimes their spouses, sometimes their children, who had explicit information to give him. And as a result, he put together a massive 7 volumes, even it's in 7 reports, I guess I should say. The UFO crash retrievals, the complete investigation status reports 1 through 7. It's pricey. If you look for this on Amazon, it ain't cheap, but I really recommend it for serious students of this subject. The problem with that is that Stringfield really never put the whole story together into one coherent historical narrative. So you've got 7 reports. It's fascinating reading, but you've got to parse it. You've got to piece things together. Because, he wrote this starting from the late 70s right up until his passing in December of 1994. So through the late 70s, all through the 80s, and into the 90s. He was busy with all of this. But keep in mind, the whole crash retrieval story was just being pieced together. They didn't have complete narratives of much, not even of Roswell. And so, he wrote a little bit about Roswell in status report number 1, and then more in number 2, and then more in number 5 and 7. It's all over the place, and that's just how it is. But the good thing about Stringfield is he was a very fine writer, very careful. He, you really can see the meticulous nature of his research. It's very gratifying to see how he put all that together. But because it's a little disjointed, I think that has hindered its broader recognition. It's a shame, but the information in there is overwhelming, and I cannot recommend it enough. Before I get into Stringfield, I'll just point out there are other researchers have contributed over many, many years to our knowledge of this subject. Stanton Friedman, Kevin Randall, Don Schmidt, Tom Carey, Linda Moulton Howe, Dr. Bob and Ryan Wood, father and son team, just to name a few. Many others, Nick Redfern, the list goes on. All of these people, many of them are still alive, put together various detailed accounts on different aspects of the whole UFO crash retrieval syndrome, as Stringfield used to call it. So what I want to do here is highlight just a sliver just a sliver of Stringfield's work, really his work on Roswell in 1947. Although I'll just mention here, Stringfield obtained information on a wide array of aspects of the retrieval of crash UFOs. Sometimes he would interview people who did guard duty where there were alleged alien bodies in some basement at Wright-Patterson, or someone who knew of firsthand of events that happened out in the Nevada desert or out, somewhere else in the world, about the so-called Blue Room at Wright-Pat, where alien artifacts were said to be stored. Stringfield really, he got these from a wide array of sources. And as you will see, as I discuss this, you will see a lot of the ways that he got these stories make it very difficult to imagine that this was an op against him. Because I know some people might be thinking that, but I strongly do not believe that whatsoever. Anyway, there's a lot of information in Stringfield's work. I strongly recommend it. Back to Roswell, Stringfield spoke to several people closely connected to it, or through a family member like a wife or child. And he not only had a lot to say about Roswell itself, like what happened there, but the aftermath of it, what steps were taken. And so, he's putting this story together bit by bit through the 1970s, through the 80s, and right up until December of 1994. Now, one very good reason why Roswell became the key case to open up the whole crash retrieval subject, because it wasn't the only acquisition of exotic tech. I think those of us, if you've studied this, you probably know this. But why Roswell? Well, I think one good reason is that it had been a genuine newspaper headline when it happened. And so there was a public memory, even if a vague one after all these years. I mean, yes, it was immediately denied, but it did make the newspapers. It was discussed. It was a public event for a little while there. And so it kind of gave researchers a jumping off point from which to dive and go ever deeper. So that's just one reason I think Roswell became what it was. Now, here's Jesse Marcel. Jesse Marcel Sr., of course, was the original key to this story. And, Stringfield wasn't the only person that Marcel spoke to. Another was Stanton Friedman, which is very well known. Another is a gentleman who is still with us today and is a friend of mine, and that's Alan Levine, who happens to be the illustrator of my history of USOs. The first volume, which came out a couple of months ago. The other two volumes, by the way, definitely coming out this year also, just saying. But yes, Alan spoke to Jesse Marcel. It's kind of a neat thing. So let me just share what Jesse Marcel told Stringfield about his role in the Roswell incident. And Stringfield was fortunate. He spoke with Marcel 3 times, starting April 7th, 1978. It's a really key moment that helped break open the Roswell case. And I do believe that Stringfield was the first to publish anything about Marcel. I think that is true. And anyway, Jesse Marcel was the intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group, or he was, I don't think he was the only, he was intelligence officer of the 509th. He told Stringfield about being dispatched to investigate debris found by the rancher Mac Brazel on his property. Many of you know this. What he discovered was extraordinary metal fragments and what appeared to be parchment strewn across a 1-mile square area. And he said, so the metal fragments, he said, varied in size up to 6 inches in length, but were of the thickness of tin foil. The fragments were unusual, he said, because they were of great strength. They could not be bent or broken, no matter what pressure we applied by hand. Think about how difficult that would be. You have something that's got the look of aluminum foil or tin foil, but you can't bend it. And then when Stringfield later asked Marcel about claims that, maybe the material was from a skyhook balloon, Marcel was adamant, and he just said, the material I gathered did not resemble anything off a balloon. A balloon of any kind could not have exploded and spread its debris over such a broad area. And then he said, I was told later that a military team from my base was sent to rake the entire area. So you already, like, you can see this was something important, like very important. Marcel also told Stringfield about observing strange markings on one of the metal beams. He called it a row of symbols that looked like hieroglyphics. That's a very interesting detail, and of course connected with similar descriptions from other crash retrieval cases that Stringfield had looked into. This wasn't the only incident of that. Marcel also explained that he had loaded the debris or helped load into a B-29 that flew to Fort Worth, Texas on orders from the Roswell-based Colonel Blanchard. As Marcel said, I was scheduled to fly it all the way to Wright Field in Ohio, that is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But when we got to Carswell at Fort Worth, the general, that is General Roger Ramey, nixed it. He took control at this point, told the press it was all a weather balloon, and ordered me not to talk to the press under any circumstances. I was pulled off the flight, and someone else was assigned to fly the stuff up to Wright Field. I'm going to return to that in a bit. And then he just added, to get the press off my back, I told them we were recovering a downed weather balloon. So I think that's all very interesting. Stringfield will soon, and I'm going to discuss this with you shortly, other individuals who completely corroborated everything Marcel said about not being allowed to fly to Wright Field. We'll get to that. But relating to Stringfield and Marcel, I really believe their shared military experience. Both of these guys served not only in World War II, they served both in the 5th Air Force in the same combat areas in the Philippines. They didn't fight together, but they were kind of there. And I think when they realized that, that really helped to create a bond of trust, which I just think adds an interesting dimension to the whole story. Now, Marcel's testimony to Stringfield was totally groundbreaking. So he was the first official military witness to confirm the recovery of anything truly anomalous from the Roswell crash site. So basically breaking decades of silence on one of the most significant UFO cases in history. But there's more. Stringfield met with this woman. This is a really interesting connection here. This lady was named Sappho Henderson. And his connection here with her, I really think stands out as significant. So she was the wife of Captain Oliver Wendell Henderson. His nickname was Pappy. That's what the crewmen in the 509th Bomb Wing called him. And Stringfield first learned about her, or about him, really, her husband, through a friend of his or associate named John August. Stringfield wrote all about this. You can read it in his book. This guy contacted him from Hawaii on Labor Day in 1988. So, and this man explained that he had discovered a Maui resident whose father, that was Captain Henderson, had flown the retrieved Roswell spacecraft, he said, from to Wright Field on a B-29. And that resident that this guy spoke to was Pappy Henderson's daughter, not the woman you're seeing here, but the daughter. So then Stringfield followed up, and he was not able just to locate the daughter, but he found Pappy Henderson's wife. Pappy Henderson was deceased, but Sappho Henderson was alive. And they talked as early as October 1st, 1988. So Stringfield didn't waste any time. So he explained what he was doing. She was very forthcoming. She approved the publication of her name in his report, not her address, but her name. And she shared what details that she could. And so she said to him, her husband died in 1986, but he had unequivocally stated to her that he flew the B-29 carrying the Roswell wreckage to Wright Field in Ohio, and that he had kept his secret faithfully until 1981, when some information about Roswell had already come out. The first Roswell book came out in 1980. So, and she said that she remembered his comment, which was, "I've been dying to tell you for years, but could not. It was top secret." And then Stringfield asked her if her husband had described the object. She didn't really have a lot to say here. She said it was strange, and she didn't give any other details. Very typical, actually, of a lot of military personnel involved in classified operations. Stringfield was actually really proud of this little contribution to Roswell research, and he wrote about it in his final report. He said, "I was the first to publish the name of Mrs. Sappho Henderson, who saw the retrieved bodies and flew some of the crash UFO wreckage to Wright Field." So that's pretty neat. And this image of her, she was recorded, I think this is from the TV show Unsolved Mysteries from 1989, September 20th, 1989. So kind of neat. So just more support to the Roswell narrative. Incidentally, Stanton Friedman spoke with Pappy Henderson's son and a cousin. Both of them also said that they had heard Pappy quietly tell his story after the news came out. Apparently in 1982, he met with several members of his old bomber crew, and one of those was later interviewed. And he just basically said, in the hotel room, Pappy told us the story of the UFO and about his part. We were all told that he flew the plane to Wright Field. He definitely mentioned the bodies. This is what the witness said. But the guy said, "I don't recall any details except they were small and different." And then he said, "I was skeptical at first, but soon saw that Pappy was quite serious." And so he took it seriously. There was another connection to Henderson, a Dr. John Crome Schroeder, who was a dentist and a Navy officer. And Stringfield wrote about him. He just said he clearly recalled Henderson talking about his flight to Wright Field with the saucer wreckage. Those are Stringfield's words. And and then Crome Schroeder said that the bodies were retrieved, but he wasn't sure if Pappy Henderson had seen them. He couldn't recall. So anyway, there's a lot of interesting kind of connections here. There's actually much more than that, but we will, I'm going to move on to this witness. This is a lady named Beverly Bean. This was from an interview in 1991, so we're going back a bit. She went by Bev. She gave interesting testimony about her father. Her father was Melvin Brown, who was a staff sergeant with the 509th Bomb Group in 1947. So Stringfield wrote about her in one of his status reports, I think it was number 5, where he talks about her. And he actually mentioned, in this case, it was the researcher Timothy Good, another great researcher, who mentioned her to Stringfield. And somehow Stringfield and she began to communicate. And in fact, she sent Stringfield copies of her father's military records, all of that. And according to what Stringfield recorded in his report, her father, Melvin Brown, later took up residence in England. So I'm guessing this is how Tim Good learned about him. Tim is a UK resident. In any case, Bev recalled that as a child, now I've tried to figure out when she was born, and I don't know exactly, but I'm thinking late 1940s. So this is early. As a child, she said her father occasionally talked about his classified work at Roswell. And she said she would giggle whenever he would describe the non-human bodies, and so he would drop the subject. And that seems strange for people to think, like, you're in a classified world, how can you talk about this? I don't think it was always the same culture back in the 1950s and 60s among ex-military men. Maybe a lot of them, but maybe some of these other individuals, I don't get the idea that it was uniformly that they were all incredibly as tight-lipped. Because I'm just saying this because I've come across many of these types of accounts. He mentioned it, he would drop the subject, and then she said it wasn't until she was a teenager, so I'm guessing maybe the mid-60s, that more details emerged, particularly after her dad read some kind of story about UFOs, and he looked very grim, she said, while telling his experience. And so what he revealed to her is that he had stood guard duty at the site where a crashed disc had come down. He couldn't understand why the bodies had to be kept cold since there were trucks of ice there. He's like, why does that have to be done? Although he and others were told that they would get into trouble if they saw too much, they did look under the cover, and they saw 2 small dead bodies. According to his daughter, He described the bodies as like us, but not like us. They were smaller than normal men. They had large heads, slanted eyes. He mentioned they looked yellowish, and he said they had a bit of an Asian appearance. That's how they looked to him. So that's pretty interesting testimony. That's yet another data point. So I mentioned earlier that Jesse Marcel had told Stringfield that he was originally going to take the Roswell remains all the way to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, but he was stopped at Fort Worth, Texas, and he was made to give the press a phony story. So Stringfield not only learned about Pepe Henderson, who did apparently take the material to Wright Field, but he found two soldiers who accompanied Marcel to Fort Worth and then back again to Roswell. And they had a lot to say. And this is a real find. So it corroborates Marcel, gives us greater confidence, I would say, in what Marcel stated. So let's talk about the remarkable flight here that Stringfield documented through these two crew members. One was a staff sergeant named Robert Slusher, and another was an airman we only know as Tim. So they had a B-29. They said it was unexpectedly called up for a mission on July 9th, 1947. And what made this flight extraordinary was the unprecedented security surrounding this mysterious wooden crate loaded into the bomb bay. And Tim, particularly, had a lot to say here. He described in detail how he said 4 military policemen went inside and took positions at each corner of the box. He said, I think 2 of them were majors and 1 a lieutenant. And then he said the 4th man was an NCO, that is non-commissioned officer. 3 other officers of company and field grade were positioned in the forward and aft crew compartments. So think about that. You have 7 high-ranking, 6 officers and an NCO guarding a single crate on a fairly short domestic flight, about 450 miles from Roswell to Fort Worth. I'm guessing this was maybe a 2-hour flight since they, as you'll see, they flew at very low altitude, which is also unusual. And so the B-29 would have flown more slowly. Slusher also provided corroboration of Tim's testimony. He independently confirmed the wooden crate in the bomb bay. He confirmed its dimensions, the unusually tight security measures at both Roswell and at Fort Worth. All of the crew apparently realized this was not routine cargo. Tim explicitly stated, he said, everything about the flight was unusual. We flew at an unusually low level, and so tight was security. We knew that the crate contained more than the general's furniture. And what's particularly telling, I think, is what happened when they landed at Fort Worth. So the plane was met by a reception committee that included, of all people, a mortician. And the bombardier, who's known as the initials FM, recognized this mortician as an old school friend. And Slusher actually recalled saying, I can still see them shaking hands and hugging. So very, very vivid description of this. And then Tim, even went further. He revealed like the whole understanding that the crew had of what they had been carrying. He said one of the crew was a very outspoken individual, said on the way home that we were now a part of history. He went on to say he knew it was the disc and remains of the flight crew because he had seen a man he recognized in the reception group. This man was a mortician by military specialty. So presumably that guy learned something from his mortician buddy about what this was. That's what it seems like. And then on the return flight, they both confirmed that Jesse Marcel was on the return flight. Slusher said to Stringfield, no doubt about it, Jesse Marcel was on our plane. He spent most of his time in the cockpit. And so that's that. Stringfield, just, I think, really put this together very, very well. And, I'm just thinking of the Project Mogul explanation, which was given here, that the Air Force stated. Mogul was a plan to, a project rather, to detect when the Soviet Union detonated their own nuclear device. Back in 1947, the Americans and only the Americans had an operational nuclear device. And so let me just go back to full screen here. And so Mogul was a balloon apparatus that was in high altitude, had acoustic equipment that was to detect this type of a thing. But the security around the Mogul was nothing like what we are seeing with Roswell, and this is all well known and well understood. In fact, the Mogul apparatus had on it was listed like a label: "If found, please contact this office." And in fact, this happened at least on one occasion where scientists in the white lab coats came to pick up a Mogul apparatus that went astray. And so the project was classified, but the technology and anything associated with it really wasn't whatsoever. So let me go on to the next highlight here, and this is the great Jim Marrs. Many of you recognize Jim. Jim was someone that I knew very well. I was close to Jim, and I had a tremendous respect for him. But Jim Marrs was involved in this story. Stringfield cited Marrs's reporting in his status report number 2, highlighting Marrs's claim about a UFO crash in New Mexico. So it wasn't necessarily the same as with Roswell. It's not really clear because there are a number of UFO retrieval claims from the 1940s. Marrs apparently wrote about this in one article from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram of January 18th, 1979. He was a journalist. If anyone is able to find this article, please put a link below. I would love to see it. I tried looking. I could not find this article. But I think it was probably a very good article that Jim Marrs wrote at the time. That would be an early article on UFO crash retrievals. It would be worth finding. But Marrs wrote to Stringfield in the early 90s. And I have quoted here on the screen what he wrote. He said, "I was an aviation aerospace writer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram from 1970 to 1980. During this time, I was also the primary writer on military matters. During this decade, on at least 2 occasions, I met men who claimed to have been stationed at Fort Worth Air Force Base in 1947. Both men told me how the rumors flew around the base after several pieces of strange metal, some covered with writing similar to hieroglyphics, were brought to the base from a New Mexico crash site. Reportedly, this metal was from a disc-shaped device which crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, sometime in July 1947. There were also rumors that dead crew members had been recovered and sent to Wright Field." That's kind of amazing. And, I would just add, Jim Marrs was in Fort Worth, and that, of course, is where the Roswell flight first went. It went to Fort Worth. And so there was a very strong connection to that region, for that region to the Roswell event. And so Jim Marrs would have been in a really superb position to learn about this. Hey, he's writing about military matters in the 1970s. And so it wouldn't be surprising that he would get wind of the rumors that would have come from Roswell to Fort Worth back in 1947, and he learned about it. There's so much more to the Roswell crash. Of course, I'm not here to do a full explication of that amazing event. There have been many outstanding books on this, not simply Stringfield's reports, of course, but full treatments by researchers like Stanton Friedman, Kevin Randall, Don Schmidt, Tom Carey, many, many others. So I strongly suggest, if you are interested in this, read these books. There's a tremendous amount of info that's in them. And then, there are other researchers who've just done great work on other aspects of the whole crash retrieval phenomenon. I think I mentioned Ryan Wood, Linda Moulton Howe absolutely has done a lot. Nick Redfern, I think I mentioned earlier. Grant Cameron, the late Harry Drew, who did some outstanding work on the Kingman, Arizona recovery of 1953. Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, who worked on the Aztec case of 48. Stan Gordon, who wrote about the Kecksburg event of 1965 in Pennsylvania. The late Art Campbell, who I think also did Aztec work. William Steinman also did Aztec work. And even Bill Moore and many, many others. The story is not just Roswell. It's, really we're talking about all recoveries of UFO craft. It's a deep story. Now, I mean, the last thing I guess I would say about Roswell is it feels like we've kind of set Roswell aside just a little bit in recent years. And maybe that's just my own impression, but for such a long time, perhaps we might have felt saturated with Roswell. It was such a huge topic of discussion. You had researchers arguing about it back and forth. And although the case was put together, I think, very well, it's a very strong case. I'm a huge fan of Witness to Roswell. I think that might be the best current book out there by Don Schmidt and Tom Carey, but many of them are excellent. Very detailed, very compelling, but nevertheless, all through those years, you had very influential skeptics with mainstream credentials, mainstream establishment support, who would, try to knock them down. And so I think for the general public, there wasn't always a very satisfying resolution to the Roswell event, unfortunately. But we haven't forgotten about it. But I do think that researchers kind of set it aside in favor of other events. It's understandable, but I think it would be a very great mistake by everyone interested in UFO disclosure to forget about Roswell. You really wouldn't want to do that. That said, my point here is to emphasize that civilian UFO research has always been the foundation of everything that we are seeing today. That is the reality. More than this, and this is not in any way to diminish the contributions of recent military insiders, by no means. I mean, David Grush, very important, Luis Elizondo, Jake Barber. Don't even forget Commander David Fravor. He's not a crash retrieval person, but he's a very important witness who has added a lot of credibility to this phenomenon. Ryan Graves, Matthew Brown, Bob Thompson, who came out recently, Fred Baker, Jason Sands, Harold Malmgren, who recently passed away, and many, many others. And then on top of that, we are aware, we don't know most of the names of the kind of multiple whistleblowers working for federal government or government contractors, and from 30 to 50 of them, who apparently have given testimony to Congress. Lots of individuals, all of them have important things to add to our knowledge of UAP. Not everyone agrees regarding the testimony of some of these people, but I think we have to say collectively it's a very strong list and very compelling amount of information. Even so, the amount of detail that we have from the previous 50 plus years of private research, pulling out, inside information on this subject, that still has not been surpassed, in my opinion, not even by the recent revelations. I would emphasize that people who are disputing the reality of UFO crash retrievals are very likely not really looking at some of this earlier research. I don't think they are. Is it that we don't like to read books anymore? Is it that most of those researchers are either no longer with us, or maybe some of them aren't as practiced in social media or video creation on YouTube? Maybe that's part of it. Is it also because they were hampered for decades by an establishment media that, frankly, just never gave them the time of day? Well, yeah, I think we can say it's all of those reasons and undoubtedly some others. There's a very strong tendency in our established media, and indeed really among most of us, to give priority to military insiders who are coming forward. And that is understandable, and it's not even necessarily wrong, at least when it comes to this subject. But these recent individuals must not be seen in isolation, as if they're the first people making these statements. And I'm sure that they would all agree with this. They are part of a much longer history of previous individuals, many of them military individuals also, who have had critically important things to say. And one important reason for me to say all of this, again, is that I think it's just becoming very common, all too common, at least in my opinion, to hear people showing skepticism about crash retrievals, in part because the recent whistleblowers on these matters are from the military. Like, it's kind of a weird thing, and I hear that and I just shake my head. The reasoning seems to go, we can't trust the military on anything, and so when you have so-called military insiders coming forward with a disclosure narrative and a crash retrieval narrative, then something must be wrong. They must be trying to deceive us. They must be trying to convince us of something. But in reality, I would say it's much harder to make that argument if you have knowledge of the massive amount of private research that has preceded all of this. And keep in mind that it was for decade after decade that private researchers kept hitting the brick wall of the military establishment, which vociferously denied any of this. And so now that we have a number of basically mid-level officials coming out to support the crash retrieval narrative, we find some of these observers finding that they're skeptical of these people. But I would say keep in mind something else, that since at least the 1950s, and probably even the 1940s, the military establishment itself was always divided on this subject. Go back and read the books of Donald E. Kehoe. I've got him pictured here. Kehoe was a retired Marine Corps major. He was a tireless researcher and advocate for the reality of UFOs. He was very well connected. He frequently in his books, he's describing these inside fights within the military. And he was able to learn about them, not just from colleagues and friends, he had many of those, but a lot of them he saw firsthand. And he shows very well that even back then, we're talking, 70 plus years ago, there were always factions from within the military that believed in greater truth and openness on UFOs. Did they believe in full, complete, 100% disclosure? I don't know. Probably not all of them. And I'm sure that's actually the case today with the current crop of whistleblowers. I don't really know for sure, but I would guess some of them are for a partial disclosure. They may not be for a complete, full disclosure. That's their position. That's their opinion. But that would still be a very big difference from saying that they're pulling an op on you, that crash retrievals aren't real, that it's, like a smokescreen. There are ops, there are lies, there are smokescreens. We all know this. But there is a war going on within the Pentagon to this day. So you've really got the two sides happening. You still have very strong opposition to everything being told by the current whistleblowers. And that faction is very powerful. And they're not just going to throw down their cards and walk away from the table just because, a few whistleblowers come out to tell their story. Those guys are in this for the long haul. And they will continue to do everything that they can to prevent or drag this process out indefinitely. For all of those who really believe in ending what my friend Steve Bassett has always called the truth embargo on UFOs, it's very important to remember our history. It's not always easy keeping on top of that while at the same time we have all these new revelations and claims coming out. It's understandable. But there is a very important legacy that researchers of previous eras have left behind for us. That's our inheritance from them, and we really shouldn't squander it. Well, that's all I have for you for today. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, subscribe to my channel. If you haven't already, click the notifications so you don't miss when I upload a new video. It doesn't happen every day, so you want to get those notifications if you're interested. Do visit my website at richarddolanmembers.com, and I will see you all again soon. Let's keep fighting the good fight. Later.